The first sign something was wrong was the dress. The second sign was the microphone, and by the time I understood what my sister had actually done, she was already holding it in front of 160 of my wedding guests. My name is Hannah Bellwether. I was 32 years old, standing at the head table at my own reception at the Ashcombe Vineyard outside Charlottesville, Virginia, when the MC, a friendly, easygoing man named Curtis who'd been hired through the venue, stepped up to the microphone stand between courses and said with total confidence, "And now we have a special addition to tonight's program, a toast from the bride's sister, Kate." I remember looking at my new husband, Ethan Sinclair, and watching his eyebrows go up in the same confused way mine must have. There was no toast from Kate on the program I'd approved. I knew that program by heart. I'd revised it 4 times over 2 months, agonizing over every detail, because that's who I am, and because my wedding coordinator, a meticulous woman named Fiona Reyes, had walked me through every single line of it personally. My sister stood up from table 3, smoothed the front of her dress. The same dress, I need you to understand, that I'd noticed hours earlier in a shade of white so close to my own gown that 3 separate guests had already asked me, half joking, if we'd coordinated, and walked to the front of the room like she'd been planning this moment for weeks. Because, as I'd find out over the next several hours, she had. Kate took the microphone, thanked everyone for being part of such a special night, and then, in front of my new in-laws, my co-workers, my grandmother's entire church group, and roughly 150 other people who had come to celebrate my marriage, she announced that she and her boyfriend, Marcus, had gotten engaged 3 days earlier and that she'd always dreamed of sharing the news with the people she loved most, and what better night than this one? There was applause. Genuine, warm applause, because most of the room had no idea what they were watching, no idea that this wasn't part of any plan, no idea that my sister had just taken roughly 4 minutes of my own wedding reception and used it to announce her engagement to a room full of my guests. I smiled. I clapped. I hugged her when she came back to the table, because what else do you do in the middle of your own wedding in front of 160 people when you don't yet understand the full shape of what just happened? Quick question, where are you watching this from tonight? I want to know who's here with me, because what I found out 3 days later about how that toast actually got added to the program is going to make you as furious as it made me. Because the printed program in every guest's hand that night, the one listing the toast schedule, the readings, the run of show, had my sister's name on it, which meant it hadn't been a spontaneous request Curtis had granted in the moment. It had been printed in advance by someone with access to my wedding files. To understand what my sister did and why, you need to understand the two of us and the particular shape of sisterhood we'd carried since we were kids. I'm the older sister by 3 years. Kate and I grew up in Roanoke, Virginia, daughters of Robert and Diane Bellwether, my father a longtime manager at a regional furniture distributor, my mother a school administrator. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable, and by most outward measures, Kate and I had a normal, close, occasionally competitive sibling relationship growing up. The competitiveness, if I'm honest, mostly ran one direction. I was the kid who got good grades without trying particularly hard, who got into a solid state university on a partial academic scholarship, who landed a stable job in healthcare administration 2 years out of college and kept it, steadily climbing, for the better part of a decade. Kate struggled more, not because she wasn't capable, but because nothing ever seemed to hold her attention or her confidence for very long. She'd started a communications degree and switched to marketing halfway through. She'd worked at 3 different companies in her 20s before deciding, at 27, to open a small boutique clothing shop in downtown Roanoke called Wren & Co. I'd been proud of her for that. Genuinely. I'd gone to her opening, brought friends, posted about it, tried to be the kind of supportive older sister I felt she deserved, especially since our parents, I could see it, even if they tried to hide it, had always seemed a little more anxious about Kate's path than mine, a little quicker to offer unsolicited advice, a little slower to trust her decisions. Wren & Co. had struggled almost from the beginning. Rent in that part of downtown had climbed faster than her revenue. By the time of my wedding, though I didn't know the specific numbers yet, Kate was roughly 4 months behind on her lease and had already taken out one small business loan she was struggling to service. I met Ethan 2 years before the wedding, at a mutual friend's dinner party. His family owned Sinclair Restaurant Group, a mid-sized but well-regarded chain of 6 upscale restaurants across Virginia and North Carolina, along with a growing supply and distribution arm that worked with dozens of smaller independent restaurants and boutique retailers throughout the region. A detail that, as you'll see, mattered enormously to what my sister did. Kate had met Ethan's parents, Richard and Constance Sinclair, exactly twice before my wedding, once at an engagement dinner, once briefly at a bridal shower. I didn't think much of those interactions at the time. I had no idea Kate had walked away from both of them with a very specific idea already forming in her head. I want to go back to the dress for a moment, because at the time, I let it go the same way I imagine a lot of brides let these things go, telling myself I was being oversensitive on a day that was supposed to be joyful. Kate's dress was a pale ivory, nearly identical in tone to my own gown, though cut differently, a fitted cocktail-length silhouette rather than my full-length train. When I asked her about it gently during getting ready photos that morning, she laughed and said, "Oh my God, I know, I actually didn't even think about it until I put it on this morning. Everything else in my closet felt wrong for a vineyard wedding, and this was just what I had. I promise I'm not trying to steal your thunder." I believed her. I want to be honest about that. I'd read enough about brides obsessing over minor slights on their wedding day to actively resist becoming one of them, so I told myself it was a coincidence, hugged her, and went back to getting ready. It wasn't until much later, after the toast, after the program, after everything else I'm about to tell you, that I learned Kate had actually purchased that dress 6 weeks before the wedding, at a boutique in Richmond, and had shown a photo of it to our mother in a group text that also included a photo of my own wedding dress for comparison, asking verbatim, "Do you think this is too close to Hannah's?" Lol, our mother had apparently responded, "It's fine, totally different necklines, don't overthink it." I found that text thread by accident, the way you find most of the things people don't intend for you to find, because Kate, 3 weeks after the wedding, asked to borrow my laptop to print something for her business, and forgot to log out of the family group chat that had been open in a browser tab. She had wondered out loud in writing 6 weeks before my wedding whether her dress was too close to mine and decided to wear it anyway. The morning after the wedding, still riding the exhausted, happy blur of the day before, I asked Fiona, my coordinator, to send over the final program file for my keepsake book, along with the other digital wedding materials she'd promised to compile. When the file arrived, I noticed something immediately. The version Fiona sent didn't match the one that had actually been printed and handed out to guests. Her version, the one she confirmed she'd finalized and sent to the printer 9 days before the wedding, had no toast listed from Kate at all. It had the schedule I remembered approving: parent toasts, best man, maid of honor, first dance, cake cutting. I called Fiona, confused, and asked if there'd been a mix-up at the printer. She checked her records and told me something that made my stomach drop for the second time in 2 days. The print shop, Alderwood Print and Design, had received a revised file 4 days after her original submission, 5 days before the wedding, sent from an email address matching mine, requesting the addition of a 5-minute toast slot for the bride's sister, Kate, along with a note instructing the shop to disregard the previous version. I told Fiona I hadn't sent that. I hadn't even known the print shop's email address. Fiona had handled that entire process on her own as part of her coordination package. Fiona pulled up the actual email chain and forwarded it to me. The email address matching mine wasn't actually my real address. It was close, disturbingly close, a near-identical variation with one letter transposed, the kind of mistake an outsider might make trying to spoof an email quickly, or the kind of detail only someone who already had my real email address memorized and was typing quickly might get slightly wrong. I stared at that email address for a long time. It wasn't a hack. It wasn't some random scammer. It was someone who knew my actual email closely enough to fake it convincingly, with just enough of a typo to reveal that it hadn't come from me at all. I brought the email to my mother first, mostly because I needed someone to help me believe I wasn't imagining the pattern forming in front of me. My mother's reaction told me almost everything I needed to know before Kate ever said a word. She didn't ask what email or are you sure or any of the questions an innocent bystander might ask. She went quiet, the particular quiet of someone recalculating how much they already knew. Eventually, she admitted that Kate had mentioned, about a week before the wedding, wanting to do something special during the reception, a toast, a tribute, something to mark the occasion as a sister. My mother said she hadn't known Kate intended to add herself to the official printed program without asking me directly. She'd assumed Kate would clear it with Fiona or with me first. I asked my mother if she'd known about the engagement announcement Kate had planned to make during that toast. She hesitated, then admitted, yes. Kate had told her about Marcus's proposal 4 days before my wedding, 3 days before the printed program correction was sent to Alderwood, and had specifically asked our mother not to say anything to me yet because she wanted the moment to be a surprise. I asked my mother the obvious question. Didn't it seem strange, even a little wrong, for Kate to be planning a surprise engagement reveal for my wedding reception, using a program change I hadn't approved, timed suspiciously close to the moment she'd learned about the engagement herself? My mother's answer was the kind of soft, conflict-avoidant deflection I'd heard my whole life whenever Kate's choices came under scrutiny. I think she just got excited, honey. I don't think she meant anything by it. You know how she gets when she's happy about something. I didn't believe, even then, that getting excited explained a spoofed email address and a printed program change submitted through a legitimate business's official intake system 5 days in advance. I confronted Kate 2 days later at her apartment with the email printout in hand. Her first reaction was defensive, almost rehearsed. I didn't spoof anything, Hannah, that's insane. I think Fiona's print shop probably just messed up the email on their end. You're really doing this the week after your wedding? Investigating me like I committed a crime? I told her I'd spoken to Fiona directly, that the email had come from an address 1 letter off from mine, sent from a device Fiona's system logged as a mobile browser, not her actual coordination software, meaning it hadn't come through the normal channel Fiona used for legitimate program updates. Kate's story shifted at that point, the way stories tend to shift once the details get specific enough to make outright denial too risky. She admitted she'd sent the email using, she said, an old email alias she sometimes used for online shopping accounts that happened to closely resemble mine, purely by coincidence, since we shared a similar naming convention our parents had picked for both our childhood email addresses years earlier. I found that explanation almost plausible on its own. Except it didn't explain why she'd specifically told the print shop to disregard Fiona's official version, or why she'd need to route a program change through an email that even slightly resembled mine instead of simply calling Fiona directly, as any actual guest with a legitimate request would have done. I asked her directly, why not just ask me? Why not call Fiona, explain she wanted a toast slot, and let me say yes or no like an adult? Kate's answer was the moment the entire evening changed for me. The moment I finally understood this wasn't really about a toast, or a dress, or even the engagement announcement itself. Because you would have said no, she said. You would have found some reason to make it about your day, the way everything's always about your day, your job, your perfect timeline. I needed people in that room to see me too. Just once. I want to pause here because there was still one more piece I didn't have yet, the piece that turned this from a sad, jealous overreach into something more calculated. About 10 days after that conversation, Ethan mentioned something to me, almost in passing, that connected everything. His father, Richard Sinclair, had told him that Kate had approached him briefly at the reception, after her toast, during the dancing, and asked whether Sinclair Restaurant Group's supply and distribution arm ever worked with small independent boutiques, the way they did with independent restaurants, and whether he'd be open to a follow-up conversation about a potential partnership or investment for her shop. Richard, by Ethan's account, had been polite but non-committal, the way people usually are when approached at a wedding with a business pitch. The kind of sure, have your people call my people response that usually goes nowhere. But Kate hadn't left it there. 2 weeks after the wedding, she'd actually followed up, emailing Richard Sinclair's office directly, referencing their conversation at Hannah's wedding, requesting a formal meeting to discuss a potential investment in Wren & Co. I found this out because Richard, uncertain how to handle it given everything else that had apparently happened, mentioned it to Ethan, who mentioned it to me. Suddenly, the entire sequence made a different kind of sense. Kate hadn't simply wanted a spontaneous moment of attention. She'd wanted access to a room full of exactly the kind of people who could help a struggling boutique survive, and specifically to Richard Sinclair, a man she'd only meet in a context like a family wedding, where declining an introduction or a brief conversation would feel awkward and unlikely. The engagement announcement, real as it apparently was, had given her the perfect vehicle. A warm, emotional moment that made her instantly sympathetic and central in the room, immediately followed by informal mingling, where she could approach Richard Sinclair not as a stranger cold pitching a business idea, but as the bride's sister who just got engaged. Someone people would want to be generous toward, in the glow of two happy occasions layered on top of each other. If you've ever realized a sibling was using a moment that belonged to you as a stepping stone for their own agenda, I want to hear about it. How long did it take you to see the whole picture? Let me know in the comments. I confronted Kate one more time with this new information at our parents' house, with our mother present because I needed a witness to what I was about to say, and because I suspected correctly that my mother needed to hear it too. I laid it out plainly, the dress she'd asked about and worn anyway. The program change routed through a near-identical email address to disguise its origin. The engagement announcement timed to land during my reception rather than in a smaller, private moment with our family. And the follow-up email to Richard Sinclair's office, using my wedding as a professional reference point 2 weeks after the fact. Kate didn't have a smooth explanation this time. She sat quietly for a long moment, then said, "I know how it sounds when you put it all together like that. But it didn't feel like a plan when I was doing it, Hannah. It felt like finally getting a chance at something. Ren & Co. is 4 months behind on rent. I've been terrified for a year that I'm going to lose everything I built. And I watched you build this whole beautiful life, this whole beautiful day, surrounded by people with actual resources, actual connections, and some part of me thought, if I don't reach for this now, I'll never get another chance like it." I asked her if she understood that reaching for it had meant taking something that wasn't hers to take, not just attention, but the actual structure of my wedding day, altered without my knowledge or consent, to serve a purpose I'd never agreed to. She said quietly, "I know, I'm not saying it was right. I'm saying I understand why I did it even if you never will." I told her those were two different things, understanding your own reasoning and being entitled to act on it at someone else's expense. I told her I could hold sympathy for her fear about the business, genuinely, while still holding her accountable for what she'd actually done with that fear. The weeks that followed were slower and more complicated than any clean resolution would suggest. And I think that's the most honest thing I can tell you about how situations like this actually play out in real families. I told Kate I needed 2 things from her, not as punishment, but as the minimum required for me to trust her again with anything that mattered. First, I needed her to personally contact Richard Sinclair's office and withdraw her investment request. Not because I had any control over whether Ethan's family chose to help her business, but because I needed the request to stand or fall entirely on its own merits, made honestly and directly, not on the residual goodwill of a manipulated wedding day. She did this reluctantly in a phone call I wasn't part of but that Ethan later confirmed had happened. Second, I needed a real conversation, not at a family gathering, not with an audience, just the 2 of us, where she could actually sit with what the day had cost me. The confusion during my own reception, the quiet unraveling of trust in the weeks afterward, the strange, hollow feeling of learning that even your own wedding day wasn't fully yours to guard. That conversation happened about 6 weeks after the wedding at a coffee shop near her apartment. It wasn't a clean, movie-style reconciliation. Kate cried, I cried. She admitted, for the first time without qualification, that what she'd done was wrong regardless of how afraid she'd been about her business, and that she'd let that fear justify a decision she knew, even at the time, crossed a line she wouldn't have crossed in a calmer moment. I told her I needed time before I could fully trust her with anything logistically significant in my life again, an anniversary party, a future family event, anything where she'd have unsupervised access to plans I cared about. She didn't fight that boundary, which, more than anything else she said that day, told me she understood the weight of what had happened. I want to tell you honestly what happened to Kate's business because I think it matters to the shape of this story. Ren & Co. didn't get saved by a Sinclair family investment. That door, understandably, never reopened. Kate spent the following several months doing the harder, slower work of trying to save it on her own terms. Negotiating a reduced rent with her landlord, cutting her inventory costs, taking on a part-time consulting gig on the side to cover the gap while she restructured. It wasn't enough in the end to save the storefront. Ren & Co. closed its physical location about 8 months after my wedding. Kate took a job managing inventory for a larger regional retailer, and about a year later, started selling a smaller curated collection online instead. No storefront, no overhead, Something she once told me felt more honest than the version of the business she'd been chasing before, the one built partly on trying to look more successful than she actually was. I won't pretend I don't feel some complicated mixture of sympathy and vindication watching that unfold. I wanted her to succeed, genuinely. I just needed her to stop trying to build that success on ground she'd taken from me without asking. I should tell you because it matters to the full picture. Kate's engagement to Marcus was real, uncomplicated by any of this. They got married about 14 months after my own wedding, in a small ceremony at a state park outside Roanoke. No elaborate venue, no printed program changes, about 30 guests total. I went. I gave a toast, my own toast, planned in advance, cleared with Kate and the actual coordinator running that day, nothing improvised or slipped in through a spoofed email. I meant every word of it. Kate had built something real with Marcus, something that had nothing to do with the version of that relationship she'd once used as a tool to get herself into a room with the right people. I think that's part of what made the whole earlier situation sting as much as it did. The engagement itself wasn't the lie. The way she'd chosen to reveal it was. I've had a lot of time now to sit with what my sister did, and I've landed somewhere more complicated than simple anger, though I want to be clear that the anger was real and justified, and took a long time to soften into anything gentler. Kate grew up watching me move through the world with a kind of steady, unremarkable competence that our family quietly rewarded with less worry, less scrutiny, less of the anxious hovering she got whenever her own path wobbled. I don't think that makes what she did to my wedding acceptable. But I understand now, in a way I didn't before, how a lifetime of feeling like the more fragile, more worried about sibling can curdle into a desperate need to finally be the one people are impressed by, even if the moment you choose to seize isn't actually yours to seize. I also learned something less comfortable about myself, that I'd spent years quietly accepting a role in our family as the one who's fine, the one who didn't need extra attention or reassurance, without ever really asking whether that role was something I wanted, or just something that had settled onto me by default while everyone's worry went toward Kate instead. Neither of those truths cancels the other one out. My sister still altered my wedding program using a spoofed email to give herself a platform I never agreed to give her, and then tried to leverage my new family's business connections for her own struggling company. That happened, and it cost something real between us that took a long time and a lot of uncomfortable honesty to even partially rebuild. Kate and I talk regularly again, though differently than we did before all this. We're more careful with each other now, not in a cold way, but in the way people are careful once they've learned exactly how much damage is possible when boundaries go unspoken for too long. She still tells me, occasionally unprompted, that she's sorry not performing it, not using it as a segue into something else, just saying it plainly, the way an apology is supposed to work when it's actually meant. I believe her more each time she does it, because she's never once, since that conversation at the coffee shop, tried to make the apology about softening what she did instead of simply acknowledging it. I think about that reception sometimes, the microphone, the applause, the moment I stood there clapping for my sister's engagement while some part of me was already quietly registering that something didn't add up. I don't regret clapping. I don't regret staying calm that night, the way I don't regret pulling on every thread afterward until I understood the whole shape of what had happened. My wedding day still lives in my memory as one of the best days of my life. And I've had to work deliberately to hold that truth alongside the harder one, that somewhere in the middle of it, my own sister rewrote part of that day for her own purposes without asking, and it took months to fully understand how far that rewriting had actually gone. I don't think love and betrayal are opposites, the way I used to assume they were before any of this happened. I think they can sit right next to each other, sometimes in the very same person on the very same night, and the work, the long, unglamorous, ongoing work, is learning how to hold both without pretending either one away. That's where I've landed. Not with a sister I've written off, and not with one I hand unlimited trust to the way I once did without thinking twice. Somewhere honest, in between, which, I've come to believe, is usually the only place real reconciliation actually lives.